Today the committee is holding its first evidence session on the work of the Foreign Secretary. We've got a lot of questions to get through today, so we heard from you, thank you, Sir Philip, last week, so we're going to primarily be directing our questions to the Foreign Secretary. We'd appreciate direct and concise answers to the questions because we've got a lot of questions and I know that you want to try and get away promptly at the end. So welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Foreign Secretary, could you briefly begin by setting out your priorities, your mission statement for the FCDO?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and it's wonderful to be before the committee, and I look forward to engaging with you over the coming Parliament. I think I've got to start with what I feel we inherited as a department. It was a department clearly where there had been a merger that this committee and others quite rightly found had gone very badly, morale lower than it should be, although I want to give some credit to Andrew Mitchell and David Cameron particularly for beginning to turn that ship around. But it's also against a backdrop in which clearly the geopolitical environment is extraordinarily tough. Wars in Europe, in Gaza, a terrible crisis in Sudan particularly, and a context in which we had badly damaged our relationships in Europe. We were on the back foot, I think, with the Global South particularly. We had abandoned our climate leadership under Rishi Sunak. And this was against a backdrop in which, as you know, coming into government, growth was our central theme, and we have a 22 billion black hole, of which you would expect the FCDO to play its part. I have instigated 3 reviews that I think are important for the purposes of this committee. One is centering growth in the department, because in the end, if we aren't the international delivery arm of the government's growth objective, that is a serious problem. Martin Donnelly is leading that review. Our relationship, our global impact, our relationship particularly with the Global South and middle power countries led by Neri Woods, and because of the long-standing discussion about the place between development and diplomacy, Manish Shafiq is leading that work on development particularly. Those remain my priorities, but I suppose day to day, as I set about my work, a reset with Europe was very important, centering growth, getting back our climate leadership particularly, and ensuring that I was engaged in the world, and that's why I've done lots of travel and been in many, many countries over the last few months. It's only been 4.5 months, of course, but to communicate that Britain is back and we are engaged. And of course, because of the wars and the crisis, it remains the case that Ukraine particularly, but also the crisis in the Middle East, has dominated much of my time.
Could I also ask you specifically about something that's happened overnight, which is the we hope the welcome news of a ceasefire in Lebanon. In the past, I know that Britain has given training and support to the Lebanese army so that they can play an important role in the Blue Line. Can I assume that we're going to renew that support in the future as a part of this peace deal?
Yes, and I would hope increase that support over this coming period. As you know, I sought to get to Lebanon both in opposition and immediately in coming into office. I gripped very quickly the potential for a crisis situation in Lebanon, and it was very important that we would put on planes and other things if people wanted to leave. Engaged substantially with both the Speaker in Lebanon, but obviously the Prime Minister McCarthy on many, many, many occasions, many, many phone calls. I was the first G7 foreign minister, and we were the first country to call for a ceasefire. We've been working very closely with US and French colleagues, right behind the Amos Hochstein plan. I'm delighted that a ceasefire has now happened, and that was indicated in the G7 meeting I had in Rome on Monday. So very pleased. You would expect us to be supporting the LAF as they try and secure the south, particularly. And we want to be in a situation where Lebanese can move back south and Israelis can move back north, and we see the end to fighting and gunshots and the death toll that we've seen, particularly of civilians.
And would you be happy to also commit today to increase our contribution to UNIFIL? Because at the moment we've only got one soldier on the blue line with a blue helmet on, whereas most of the European countries have got hundreds within UNIFIL. So I know that we give support to the Lebanese army, but can we also send more people to play a role, an important increased role on the blue line in Lebanon?
My commitment is for us to stand by Lebanon, and that means increased support going forward, and we play an important role. That has been primarily in support of the armed forces. I'm happy to look again at our UNIFIL contribution, but I'd want to do that in discussion with G7 partners like Italy that play a big role, and of course
they have more than 1,000, you see.
And of course with the Defence Secretary. The truth is, the load is spread across the globe, and I don't want to commit troops just off the cuff here, but I do want absolutely to stand by Lebanon and to hope that ceasefire holds, and to do all it can to ensure that, as I say, those communities on both sides are able to move back to their homes.
I think I've just realised that Jemilai's son is sitting behind Sir Philip. I just want to acknowledge you. I know that many people here have met you in the last few weeks. In March 2017, shortly after the inauguration of Trump 1.0, I asked the then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson about the new president's attitude to climate change, in particular about the Paris Climate Agreement. And he told me that I was being unduly pessimistic. He told me that Britain could use its considerable influence to encourage the president to see things our way. I don't need to remind the room that obviously the president then pulled out of the Paris Agreement to the considerable detriment of our climate fight against the global fight against climate change. We've heard a lot from around the department in the last 4 months about leveraging our close allyship with the USA to influence Trump 2.0. If the former Foreign Secretary's jingoistic optimism failed to influence the president, I wondered if you thought that progressive realism might be a better influence. Will it make any difference?
Well, I mean, you have to deal with one president at a time, and of course it's not until January the 20th that President-elect Trump will come to office. I think the second thing that should guide us, particularly in relation to climate, is in speaking to Republican friends over the last few months, but actually also before the general election, they were at pains to emphasise that the Biden plan centred on the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of those manufacturing jobs in that race to clean energy in the context of the United States are actually based in red states. They therefore are based in areas that effectively President Trump has won and more. And for those reasons, the wholesale rolling back of the agenda that we've seen from the United States over the last 5 years was unlikely. That does make political sense to me. There are rules with the degree to which we can engage with a transition government before they've taken office. So I don't know what the current plans are in relation to climate, but I take some confidence from that. I think the tone and the expression, of course, would be different from Joe Biden's government. That's clear, but we have to wait and see. We will. I think the immediate concerns that I am hearing, and of course you hear very strongly if you're in Washington, D.C., are around China, are around the economic threat of China, and therefore the fallout of that, some of which will definitely impact on the climate agenda.
I've mentioned briefly climate change and the Middle East. I just wondered, where else in the world do you think that the FCDO can currently have the most impact?
Look, I think the Commonwealth is important. We mustn't forget our Commonwealth family, and I say that having just returned from Samoa with His Majesty the King. And I do think, as I say, our reset with Europe is vitally important in this period where there is war still on the continent, and we have to work closely with our major allies. And look, there's no doubt about it, the soft power of both our development spend, but also institutions like the BBC World Service, the British Council and others are hugely, hugely important and should not be underestimated. What I found in 4.5 months in the job is the global community want us there. They want us in the room. They've missed us. They're delighted when I'm back in Indonesia, in Laos, in Nigeria. I couldn't believe there'd not been senior visits to South Africa over the last. These countries want to see us again. They want to engage with us. They want to speak to us about the issues of the day, particularly energy, climate finance, those sorts of issues. They welcome Britain's return.
You've told us that the FCDO are undertaking lots of reviews, and I wondered if you'd be kind enough just to make sure that we could be written to be given the full list of all the reviews, because I'm not sure we know for sure exactly what all the different reviews are, and the forthcoming strategies and so forth. And I wondered particularly about the China review, if you would agree to publish all the reviews once they've happened, but also particularly if you would come back and see us again to talk specifically about China when the China review is published.
Can I just say specifically on that, it is also the case, and I should have said this at the beginning, the SCDO, like other government departments, have had so many foreign secretaries I've lost count, so many ministers I've lost count, and I suppose there is a sort of sense almost, there was at the beginning, I think from diplomats and senior civil servants, here again we've got a new foreign secretary and a new set of ministers. It has taken a little while, but I think it's definitely been gripped. No, this is a new government. And so I know that there are both the reviews that I've initiated, that I've explained, but also the China audit to which you refer. I think it is natural and important that we try and set an outlook that sustains us for what I hope is at least a decade, and set a course that ensures that Britain is absolutely achieving all that the public and I think the world hope that we can achieve, particularly as a P5 nation over this next decade. Of course, we will write to you and keep you updated about the progress of that work.
When the audit is published, will you come and see us and talk to us about it?
Happy to do that.
Thank you. There's one review which I'm particularly interested in, and that's, I'm told, there's a small ministerial group looking at sanctions, and they to see if we've got the right approach, looking at whether our sanctions policy is properly resourced. I mean, there are many people who would say that perhaps the single biggest benefit of leaving the European Union is that we can now set our own sanctions policy, but we need to get it right. I mean, sanctions can be a really good tool for foreign policy. It can deter malign behaviour. It can support human rights, but it has to be done in a way which is consistent and comprehensive and properly enforced. So I understand that yesterday the Treasury Committee heard from the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, and they heard that there'd only been one £15,000 fine for a sanctions breach in the last year. So my question really is, we're in the early days of our sanctions policy. We want to make sure that we get it right. When this group of ministers considers what we should do next, is one of the things which they're going to consider that there should be some form of parliamentary scrutiny of our sanctions policy and sanctions implementation? Because it does seem to me that there's no reason why our sanctions policy shouldn't be a trailblazer for the rest of the world.
100%. You will have seen that I have used the tool of sanctions pretty aggressively against Russia and the Russian shadow fleet particularly. I think we now have more sanctions against Putin and his shadow fleet than any other country in the world at this point. But you're absolutely right. Enforcement is key. We raised this as an issue. In fact, I think it was more or less a cross-party issue because there were out there, those in the last government raised it as well from the backbenches, that enforcement was just not where you'd expect it to be. That's why we instigated a review. I do think it needs more scrutiny and a thorough look. I want to be able to come back to the committee on illicit finance generally, which I've said is a priority across the government, and there are announcements to come on how we might have a champion or an envoy across government taking on these issues. That clearly involves FCDO, the Home Office and the Treasury, and therefore we will come back to you.
Good. Okay, so a last question from me. So what do you want to achieve in your first 12 months as Foreign Secretary? Because we want to be judging you against that. So what should we review with you at our next session to see if you've delivered results?
Well, look, I think that we can take at least one lesson from Donald Trump, and that is the art of the deal. And given that growth is such a central challenge for our country, judge me by the deals that I'm able to secure over this next while. I've opened up foreign policy dialogues with the European Union under the FAC. Very important to that is the new EU Defence Pact. We need to secure that pact. We have begun discussion with our German colleagues about a new friendship treaty, which I hope will deliver for the British people and for our friends in Germany. I have a new tech security initiative with India, a new strategic partnership with Nigeria, a new growth plan with South Africa. Again, we want to see returns on those deals between our countries. And of course, the Global Clean Power Alliance is an attempt by the Prime Minister, working with President Lula, with Mia Mottley in Barbados and others, to both get the climate finance, particularly to the Global South. That is a win for UK business and industry. So I think we've got off to a good start. I can see a few deals emerging. Judge me by more, because in the end, growth is absolutely number one for our economy, and the Foreign Office is not just a department dealing with crisis or dealing with geographic expertise. It's got to be centering that growth on behalf of the government's first mission.
I wanted to ask you some questions about FCDO funding, and I think, Edward, you're going to lead on this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. You started off by saying that you've been on the road, having visited some of our posts overseas. So my first question is, what is your view of our global footprint? Do we have the right people in the right places with the right facilities? And if we don't, where are we wanting?
Well, first off, I am hugely impressed by the civil servants I've met, by the diplomats I've worked with. They are an impressive, bright, hugely committed, motivated group of people, and I think we should be very, very proud indeed. We are still, as I say, a country to which much of the world looks. We have an important place on the UN Security Council, and I was in New York last week pushing forward on Ukraine, on Gaza, on Sudan, and hugely supported by Barbara Woodward and the fantastic team we've got in New York, and that is replicated across much of the world. The footprint I'm more or less comfortable with, but there are issues around skill set. I don't think the department reflects the country, socioeconomic background particularly, and it certainly is not as diverse as I think as some other parts of Whitehall. In terms of skill set, I think there should be much more fluidity between business and industry, the sort of economic skills and finance skills you need, given that we have a service economy and that growth is so important, and we need to work on that. And I was able to secure in the spending review with the Treasury sufficient money for a change programme in the department, so that people can come through, particularly people in the middle, can come through and take up those leadership positions, and others. It's definitely a top-heavy department. Are able to move out and make way. So it is going to be a period of change, but change with the grain of the system. Because I think if you speak to our diplomats, they would reflect this back to us. That goes with what is now necessary, I think, for a 21st century foreign and development department.
Do you have a follow-up on personnel? Because I know that Matthew does, if you want.
Go for it.
Do you mind if I just go?
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Foreign Secretary. When Sir Philip was with us a week ago, I asked a question about the fact that more men were receiving bonuses than women in the Foreign Office, which doesn't seem right to me. We asked for a note about the gender pay gap and by when it might be eradicated. The note says there's no date that they aim or target in terms of an eradication. My broad view is if we're not measuring that and we haven't got an end goal, we're never going to get there. Are you able to commit to the Foreign Office coming up with a date by which they aim to have eradicated the gender pay gap?
I'm able to commit to better data, more use of data in the department over this next period. And of course, I would want to see any gender pay gap eradicated. The department has made rapid progress on its journey for better female leadership right across the department. You see that reflected in our embassies across the world. And there was a moment where I think the whole G7 had female ambassadors. Now, but you've got to get underneath the bonnet, which is what your question's doing. How much are they paid? Are they getting the correct bonuses? What's going on in the system? And as I say, there's a broader suite of issues across the diversity piece. And the point is there have to be the right KPIs, data and indicators on the back of that. And I'm quite sure we're not quite there yet. So you have my undertaking to get into that over this coming period for sure.
I mean, I can assure you we will keep asking till we find out when the deadline is going to be. I'm going to set him on it.
It won't be a question. Just comment on that, though. I think actually coming from the top, the suggestion that that's what you want to see is what's going to make change happen. In my experience of past organisations, it's when the top say, actually, we care about this and we'd like you to get there. You can't always make that happen at the right time, but it sets things in motion that I think would be a really, really strong signal.
Well, I support you in that. I guess I'm seasoned enough to know that at some point I may no longer be Foreign Secretary. And what you don't want is what we've seen over these last few years with a cycle of Foreign Secretary and the system goes back to doing what it used to do. So how can we make this systemic is the question. Hence the reviews, hence the change programme that's coming, and hence the scrutiny I welcome from the Select Committee.
Thank you.
Sorry, going back to you, Edward.
That's fine. You mentioned previously in your previous answer about securing funding from the Treasury, which is timely, because when Sir Philip visited us last week, along with the Finance Director, we were talking about funding for maintenance of the estate and the overseas footprint, and the fact that that has traditionally been serviced by selling assets, recently Tokyo and Bangkok, raising about 1.1 billion. Your Finance Director says that money runs out around 2026. I think, his figure was an annual run cost of about low 100 million. The National Audit Office says 250 million. So have you had conversations with the Treasury about how that's funded once there's no more silverware to sell? Because otherwise, presumably, you have to cut something else within the FCDO to fund it.
We have begun those conversations, but I expect to get in detail in those conversations in the next spending review cycle. You're absolutely right. Our estate is hugely important and reflects our country abroad. And, there are some embassies in fine fettles. There are others. For example, I was in China. That is not fit for purpose, frankly, for Britain in the 21st century. So we will need some sort of capital pot to spend on that estate, and that's a discussion that I will get into with Treasury colleagues over the coming months for this next spending cycle.
And if you don't secure the adequate funding, I mean,
well,
if it is 250, what has to be cut if there is no more? Or is there silverware that comes
Well,
up?
it was a tough spending envelope that we've just secured. In the end, I got a settlement of 11.5 billion for this next year and 12.2 billion going forward. I also had a tiny uplift, but it was there on our ODA spending of 9.2. So in a tough environment, I think the department did relatively well. But you're right, that does not go to capital spend on buildings, so there's more to do. And perhaps when I come back to the committee, we'll have got a result on that and you can press me a bit more.
I think Claire has a question on this.
Thank you very much. So, linked to the conversation we had last week with Sir Philip as well, and you touched, Foreign Secretary, at the start on the fact that you inherited this failed merger when you first walked into the department. I wondered if you could perhaps please elaborate on that for us and set out some of those challenges that you have inherited and the work that you're undertaking, and perhaps highlight for the committee any particular areas of concern that you're still focusing on around that merger at this time.
Well, I think that the department lost capability, particularly in development. People left the department, good people. There was a strong evidence base to much of the work that was going on the development side. And in a merger that was rushed, I think, a significant amounts were lost. And then there were cuts in year that were very difficult, I think, in the field and damaged us reputationally as well. Manoush Shafiq's work will be very important to help us get back that capability and to set a course. But if I could just, and obviously Annalise Dodds is doing tremendous work leading on this agenda for us and for the government. But let me just sort of outline the sorts of things that Annalise and I have been looking at and discussing. One is to say that the world today is not the world that we were in when we were last in government in 1997. China's Belt and Road has happened and is happening. There are countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, playing much bigger roles on the development side in their region. We ought to be partnering with some of those countries actually in a deeper way, particularly in the continent of Africa. And when you speak to leaders in the Global South particularly, what they say is that they want partnership, not paternalism. And actually what that means is they want the same that we want for our country, growth and jobs. And then we have the challenges facing Europe, particularly of migration, people leaving areas that are experiencing the climate emergency, particularly conflict, fragility and other things. So all of that has got to be centred in our developmental work. Much of it remains really important on the humanitarian aid side, but what is development? What are our capabilities? How do we meet the Sustainable Development Goals? How do we do more in relation to areas of huge expertise in this country? Higher education, science, our innovation base, our health system and our health service, our education system. I think we've got to do more and better work over the coming years.
Thank you for that. And just to follow up specifically, you touched there on the fact that you're looking to do more. Now, obviously, you're doing more with less because of the last Conservative government's cut in terms of ODA from 0.7 to 0.5%. I wonder what your view is, Foreign Secretary, on whether that has harmed the UK's soft power.
Well, I shouldn't. If I stressed more, some of that's different. Because I also was stressing that we can't just do the same that we did back in the last Labour administration because the world has moved on. Look, of course I want us to get back to 0.7%, but I accept that it's a tough fiscal environment, and also that the work that Yvette Cooper is leading to deal with the huge backlogs that we've got on asylum and immigration, the spend that we're spending with people in hotel bills. To bear down that, of course, will put less pressure on the ODA budget and give us more to spend. And it's why I'm keen to work with her upstream on migration type issues, but why I'm also pressing her to go quicker and faster to deal with that crisis that we've got in our hotels, so that we can spend that money better in country and not on housing people in hotels in our own country.
But just on that question, in terms of the soft power aspect, do you believe that cut, that downgrade in spending, has had an impact on Britain's role in the world and how we're seen in terms of our soft power and our influence?
Oh, I think it did have a major impact on our reputation because of the way it was done. Particularly, I'm not finding, if I'm honest, when I've been in, as I was recently in Nigeria or South Africa or Laos, that's the first thing that people are raising with me. I think that they have now adjusted, and it is the case, and I hope that you'll see this in terms of our IDA replenishment, in terms of the multilateral arrangements that we participate in, that we can still, play an important role and a significant role. But it does make, there are difficult choices that we have to make.
Thank you.
Do you agree with the Permanent Secretary who said that the cut to the ODA budget gave the impression that we were an unreliable partner?
Yes, I do.
Thought you might.
I do, because you can't. Am I being too diplomatic, Chair?
You're being more diplomatic than I'm just saying. Let's move on. John, you wanted to talk about soft power as well?
I did. Foreign Secretary, in relation to soft power, you're obviously responsible for certain instruments like the BBC World Service, the British Council, the Chevening Programme, and we understand that you're establishing a soft power council. Now, DCMS obviously covers a lot of other areas, but you could also include the Department for Education, the Ministry of Justice, even the Royal Family. So can you say something about the new council? When is it going to be established? What are its terms of reference? Who will be on it?
Well, I think this comes out of a view, which I hope you might share, that we have been, despite the huge soft power assets that we have, from the British BBC World Service to the Tate to the Royal Family to actually our development spend, we've not been punching above our weight in this area, and we've certainly not been as coordinated as we could be. And again, in foreign policy terms, at the same time, there are particularly middle powers investing heavily in this area, and we have to be fit for purpose. So if you look at the Republic of Korea and what they're doing, if you look at the Turkey and their investment, particularly in broadcast over this last period. Sadly, if you look at our political our political adversaries like Russia, so we have to be really, really focused and better coordinated. The coordination between DCMS and FCDO in this area has not been as strong as it could have been. I'm really keen to work closely with Nisa Nandi. I hope to establish the Soft Power Council soon. I think the names that will be on that council will be familiar to you, Sir John. Many of them you will know from your experience. And it's an attempt to coordinate better and get better bang for our bucks, and also to look at the gaps and look at what more we could do. And of course, there's a job of work for me to do. I did get a good funding settlement for the BBC World Service in the spending review, which I was very pleased about. I think there's more to do with the British.
So will we.
There's more to do with the British Council. I think over this, but still doing tremendous work. I mean, I saw wonderful work when I was in India, but I don't think that the British Council is doing as much as they would like to be doing over this period. And the other thing that I'm really aware of is, again, when I was last in government, the innovation in the system that was really shaking up British soft power, both domestically and internationally, was the lottery. And how can we think fresh about new sources of income or a better coordinated income that might give us bang for our buck internationally? Those are the sorts of questions that I'll be challenging this Soft Power Council to answer for us.
Okay. And in terms of delivering on objectives, obviously there are some which are easy to measure, like the number of visitors who come to the UK, the number of overseas students who come to be educated here. But how are you actually going to quantify influence? Are you going to have specific targets and objectives which you will seek to achieve?
This is a perennial debate in DCMS, and it's a perennial debate in the Foreign Office. What does success look like? How do we measure it? My instinct is that in the change that I outlined, new personnel, stronger priorities and objectives, particularly around growth, and in an area of public policy where there are some very assertive countries in that middle power group, we will need more KPIs than we currently have. It will take some work to work out what those are. And I hope that the reviews that are underway, particularly the Global Impact Review, might help us in that regard.
I think that Edward has a follow-up, and then I'm going to Uma.
I just wanted to jump in on you mentioned in passing there that you don't think the British Council is doing as much as it should or wants to.
Well, it's not doing as much as it used to.
Yeah. So,
because of cuts.
But also, it's being forced to pay back its COVID loan at commercial interest rates. Do you think that's consistent with trying to get it to do more?
I think it's a very challenging environment for the British Council. And as I said, the truth is I had to prioritise in the spending review we just come out of. I'm pleased that I was able to secure further funds for the BBC World Service. I was not able to do that for the British Council, but it's a work in progress. I hope to return to the issue.
We would all be disappointed if we didn't hear the question that we know Uma's going to ask.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. So we've been leading a review into the soft power impact on BBC World Service, and I've asked every person who's attended this same question, including Sir Philip Barton. So we've discussed recently about the closure of BBC Arabia Radio. This same frequency has now been taken over by Russia Today. And we've had examples where BBC broadcast and previous channels that they've broadcast on, the frequencies have been bought either by Russia Today, by Sputnik or Chinese state radio media. Experts have called it a disaster for the region, with no fair or impartial news being made available. They've said it was a trusted source and there's no longer any impartial news. Do you think that future assessments of funding for the World Service should consider the impact on international and national security and the impact on disinformation in our world?
Yes, I do. Look, I think let's be absolutely crystal clear about this. In the tough geopolitical environment that I outlined, I am worried about the emerging axis between countries like Russia, Iran and the DPRK. We tend, rightly in this committee no doubt, will be very focused on the hard power and some of the challenges we have with war and conflict particularly. And that will dominate much of your time, I suspect, over the course of this Parliament. But if we think back to the Cold War period, it was also the case that we had to win the battle of hearts and minds. And we all know in the end, you don't get change solely through hard power. Soft power is important. And if it is the case that the British language or the work of the BBC World Service is receding, and other countries are stepping in, then I'm afraid I don't think we're living up to generations of the past. So I was pleased to be able to secure the extra funding or the uplift of 32.6 million in the last spending review to ensure that we weren't in a position where the BBC World Service was having to close language services. And I'm grateful to the representations that the BBC made, and I'm grateful to the Treasury for understanding that case. But I do believe the basis of your question is entirely right.
Uma, please, the follow-up question is the one we want to hear.
Yeah, you've stumbled me. What's my usual follow-up?
You were on the World Service.
I'll cede the time that we've
Very good. All right. Well, that's very disciplined because we are running behind. So, Afra, I think that you were going to lead off on the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, please.
Was indeed.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I was pleased to hear you say that the Commonwealth is important in one of your earlier answers. You attended the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting with the Prime Minister recently. However, there were notable absences, with both the South African Prime Minister and Indian Prime Minister choosing instead to attend the BRICS summit chaired by Vladimir Putin and held in Russia. Of course, both India and South Africa are important players in the Commonwealth and offer much in terms of their contribution, so it's regretful that they didn't attend. Why do you think these leaders opted to attend the BRICS summit, and what can be done to improve the value of the Commonwealth so that leaders treat it and CHOGM as a priority?
Well, look, I think that if you look at the multilateral forums at the moment and multilateral system as a whole, clearly the UN is having tremendous challenges with Russia, China using their veto particularly and disrupting our ability to achieve consensus. I was hugely disappointed to be at the UN last week on a Sudan humanitarian resolution where Russia chose to exercise its veto at the last minute, for example. So, of course, it's the case that other forums in which we come together become really important. The G7 is hugely important for us. The G20 is an important forum as well. The Commonwealth, it seems to me, is unique because of its footprint globally, because it's an ability, what the Australians and those in the Pacific Islands say to me is it's an ability to engage with countries in Africa in a way that would be actually very difficult if we didn't have this forum. And if you look at the things that bind countries together, there's the political, there's the cultural, and then there's the economic. When I challenge leaders and foreign ministers as to why they were off to BRICS, they tended to say it's the economic that's important to us. And clearly, I think we've got to recognise that China as a superpower is there. They didn't want to. They played down the political coming together. The Commonwealth as an institution is not a political coming together. I mean, clearly, that's self-evident that there are countries that are non-aligned in that group, as well as countries like ourselves. Some say it's an interesting forum because neither of the superpowers are there, and they quite like it for that reason. I do think there's more to do economically, and I was very pleased when I was there to kick-start and put quite a lot into a trade initiative across the Commonwealth family, recognising that huge trading partners like India, Canada, Australia, Singapore and South Africa are around the table, and it accounts for 9% of total UK trade, particularly worth 164 billion. But there's more, I think, that we can do and we need to do over this coming period. And I know the Singaporeans were pressing this as we were around the table, because in the end it's growth that leaders and foreign secretaries want to see in their respective countries. I think that wonderful strength of the Commonwealth, just going back to the other heading, cultural, is of course its young people. And the youth profile across the Commonwealth is impressive and amazing, particularly because of the representation on the African continent. You've got countries like Togo and Gabon that are joining at this time. So that's what I keep in mind. We have a new Secretary General starting, so this is a new refresh period for the Commonwealth. More focused, I think, probably on growth, particularly initiatives around young people, education. Its core strengths, I think, will mean that it remains a powerful body over the coming decades.
Thank you. And that answered some of my next question, which was helpful. At the conclusion, of course, of CHOGM, a communiqué was signed by the 56 heads of government, which outlined the issues discussed at the summit. And of course, as you know, the communiqué acknowledges the calls for discussions on reparatory justice for the abhorrent transatlantic slave trade. You are on record supporting reparations in the past, and I understand this is an issue, of course, that you'll feel strongly about. I believe in 2018 you said in the House of Commons, as a member of the British Caribbean community, that we don't just want to hear an apology, we want reparations. I understand the context of those remarks were, I think at the time, in relation to the Windrush scandal, but nonetheless, as a then senior member of the opposition, your remarks would have been heard by other countries who seek reparations. And indeed, I think Sir Hilary Beckles, who is a leading reparations campaigner, has called you a supporter of discourse on reparations. So given those past comments that you've made, do you accept that those who support financial reparations in other countries will feel encouraged by your position to escalate this matter and put pressure on the UK government to make payments?
Well, look, I think the starting point is to recognise that the Commonwealth brings together countries that are very diverse, and this was not just a Commonwealth meeting of Caribbean nations. We have Pacific states there, we have many African countries there, and actually what I was talking about before, that we launched the investment plan of action to mobilise investment across the Commonwealth. That's the number one thing people care about. We were talking about climate finance and climate initiatives. Again, that was the number one thing that Commonwealth members were talking about. Thank you for recognising that back in 2018, I was the leading voice in Parliament on the Windrush scandal. I'm afraid it was a very low moment in our national story. And I make no apologies for bringing that scandal to public attention, the treatment of a generation of people that came to this country and made a huge commitment, building our railways, building our NHS, gave so much and took so little, and the way that they were denied services by the government of the day, I think really caused a lot of pain and concern right across British society. And it was in relation to that I talked about the compensation that so many of those families have still been denied as a result of that scandal. And I know that Yvette Cooper and colleagues are getting to grip to make sure that that injustice is dealt with. That's quite separate, I think, to the issue that you're referring to. The Caribbean nations who make up part of the Commonwealth family have a 10-point action plan. And if you read that 10-point action plan, you will see that they're talking about, like a lot of middle-income countries, they're talking about more investment in tech, they're talking about climate finance and the climate emergency because it affects those islands acutely. They are talking about education and health. And those are areas where we absolutely, in terms of the future, would intend to be in dialogue with the Caribbean. That's why we have, for example, a 200 million infrastructure fund with Caribbean nations assisting them when there are hurricanes and other things. So that was the nature of the conversation. There was no discussion about reparation and money, and the Prime Minister and I were absolutely clear that we will not be making cash transfers and payments to the Caribbean, but we are absolutely happy to have the dialogue about the future, our future relationships, and we will continue with those.
So just to clarify on that, because obviously, as you've alluded to, the Prime Minister committed to engaging in meaningful, truthful and respectful conversations about reparations. So you've talked...
No, I think language is really important.
It is.
I don't think you'll find the word reparations in the communique.
So can I clarify then how you think he and you intend to fulfil the commitments of those? Is when you say conversations, do you intend for there to be actual outcomes at the end of those, and will there be a financial tag attached to them?
Well, I've said that, you've pushed me on the word reparation. I've pushed back and said it's not in the communique. I don't know if you've read the communique. It's not in the communique. It was never put to us in that way. I know there was some coverage in the British media along those lines, but that is not in the communique. The phrase that's in the communique is not that. It is, you don't know, do you?
I'm hoping that you're going to tell me, as you're the Foreign Secretary.
You ought to look at the communique if you're going to put the question. The phrase is reparative justice. That was the phrase that they used. And in that context, they talked about a dialogue, and I've just said to you that we're happy to get into that dialogue. They talked about the future, tech, education, health. We're happy to have that conversation with the Caribbean. We're already investing in climate finance. That was the nature of the conversation. There's a caricature about sending cash, and I have rejected that caricature. So I think I've answered your question decisively.
Yeah, I think I'm just asking you if there is, you're saying that you're looking at things like investing in tech, etc., and I'm saying, have you considered whether there is a financial aspect to that, or you're simply going to give words but not actually follow through with a financial element to it?
But we already invest in the Caribbean. I mean, we have a 200 billion infrastructure fund. We have embassies right across the Caribbean. We have overseas territories in the Caribbean. So we're already doing things with the Caribbean.
Yeah. And so you feel that addresses the communique of reparatory justice?
Well, I've simply clarified for you the conversation that we had, not the caricature that was sometimes put in the papers, and I've done that quite strongly because I think the challenge back to me, I am in the end, my ancestors were slaves, and I don't run away from that fact. That is a fact. It was a terrible time. I'm very proud to have been part of a government under Tony Blair, where we commemorated the abolition of the slave trade, the tremendous work done by people like Wilberforce and the city of Hull, the work in places like Liverpool and Bristol, the campaigns, ordinary people across this country fighting to end that terrible, terrible moment. But at this point in time, we now look forward, we look to the future, we look to hope and possibility with those countries. There's much that we can do together. Climate finance is the centre of that. I was very pleased to be with Mia Mottley just a few days ago on a platform at COP on these issues. It's the future, I think, that we should keep in mind, not payments of the kind that I saw in the papers, but were not raised with me by any leader that I met, and I'm afraid the British government are very clear on we cannot do.
We might need
just a final question with the future in mind. Between now and the next Heads of Government meeting, are there any kind of clear and explicit outcomes, not to do with this last topic, but in general, for what you would like to see us progress on with CHOGM and with our Commonwealth friends and partners?
Oh, look, I'm hugely excited by this moment. We have a new king that's really inspirational and was inspirational to spend time with in Samoa. We have new initiatives, new scholarships for Commonwealth young people, and I hope to be able to say more about that in the coming months. We have a new Secretary General, so I think there'll be renewed focus within the Commonwealth. I want to build on the investment plan of action that I launched at the Commonwealth and grow more in terms of growth and economy and trade across the Commonwealth family. I think there'll be sharper focus at this time, particularly on the strengths of the Commonwealth, and I do think education is an example of that. So this is an exciting time, and it's a time of change and possibility for sure. Thank you.
We're starting to slip behind, so if we could perhaps speed up a little bit and perhaps have slightly shorter answers, and we have slightly shorter questions. I'm sorry to do this, but if we're going to finish on time, which I think we want to, we need to move on fairly rapidly and deal with the huge subject of climate and nature as shortly, but you can, please.
Thank you, Chair. So just a small topic there, Foreign Secretary. And you've touched on this in some of your previous answers, but I was keen to dive into it in further detail. And in your Kew Garden speech, you said that action on the climate and nature crisis will be central to all that the Foreign Office does. So I wanted to ask, what changes have you made to start to see this come to fruition, and what plans do you have to further advance this as well, noting your comment earlier about the backset we've seen under the last government?
Well, look, I think that it was very important to make that my first speech and to centre climate in that speech and to say that it's a foreign policy issue. It goes to the heart of security, the problem without passports that we particularly see in the world, migration being one of those particularly. I think it was very important to see the Prime Minister and President Lula launch the Global Clean Power Alliance in Rio off the back of my speech, and in this last period reaffirming the 11.6 billion that we want to spend in climate finance is really important. The 3 billion on nature, of which 1.5 billion of that is on forests, and working alongside, for example, Indigenous communities, I think is extremely exciting, and the leadership that we're going to need over this period as we press for MDB reform, particularly the appointment of 2 envoys on climate and nature, I think are an important contribution, all of it to get back our climate leadership role and to support those in the Global South in their race for clean energy at this time as well.
Thank you. So looking ahead to you returning to be in front of this committee in, say, a year's time, what would success look like across this period? How do we judge that has been success and good progress on those measures that you're starting to set out there and bring about?
I'd certainly like to see the Global Clean Power Alliance beginning to deliver for the Global South on the finance side. I'd like to see the sorts of changes we'd want to see in the World Bank and the IMF, bearing fruit over this next horizon. COP was a challenge, and I think Ed Miliband sort of conveyed that at the dispatch box. Nevertheless, the world came together and agreed the 300 billion, which I think is really significant and really important. And of course, we should, at this time, on behalf of taxpayers, I think we all understand this is not just about taxpayers' money. It is about the role of private corporate funds as well, and the private sector alongside philanthropy as well. How we lever to grow that 300 billion so we meet 1.5 is essential. And of course, we've got to stay alongside those, like Indigenous communities, that are the custodians of our forests at this time, as well as grow the green jobs within our own country. So I hope that in a year's time you'll be able to measure and see some of that. But of course, in this area, this is not just about UK leadership. It is about partnership globally, particularly with the big emitters in the world.
Absolutely. And you made it very clear earlier, Foreign Secretary, that growth is central to your work and the department's work as well. So I was wondering about if you have red lines when it comes to climate and nature. Say, for example, in a trade deal, unfortunately not every country around the world shares our ambition for tackling the climate and nature crisis at this pace. What would you do in that scenario? Are you finding an issue already in some negotiations, or what are the UK's red lines on climate when it comes to trade?
Well, we're pretty clear that we have made decisions, particularly about not offering any more licences in the North Sea, and so we have made internal decisions. We've seen the end of coal effectively here in the UK, and therefore, as we partner with countries, we are having that dialogue about fossil fuels particularly. But I think we also have to be sensitive that countries have different starting points, particularly in the global south, as we work with them. So this is not about hectoring or lecturing. That tends not to work. It's about encouragement, it's about nudging, and it's about supporting where we can, and growing, as I say, those who race to clean energy, because that's a win also for British business.
One final question from me on this area. You touched on COP there, and obviously you were there very recently, and you talked about the outcome being quite positive. Now, COP has been criticised, however, for not being able to tackle perhaps the challenge at the pace that's needed as well. I wondered about your reflections on that, and whether you feel that more broadly we have the forums we need to tackle the scale of the issue internationally.
Well, it's over 190 countries coming together. I mean, this is the vehicle we have. It's frustrating. You're trying to get consensus. This isn't always easy. But we are making progress. It's not always as fast as we would like it to be. And, someone once said that, diplomacy feels like it's failing until it wins, if you see what I mean. So I don't say it's not hard, and I don't say it's not frustrating, but I think we were able to make progress at this COP. I've got huge hopes for the COP in Brazil next year, and there I think you'll see good partnership between the UK and Brazil particularly.
Thank you.
Move on to the EU, Richard.
Thank you. At the outset, Foreign Secretary, it was really good to hear you say that relations with the European Union will probably be one of your top priorities as Foreign Secretary. I think you said one of your top 3 priorities. I wonder if you could say a little bit more, please, about the reset. What does a reset between the UK and the EU mean in terms of our relationship?
Well, I mean, we, under the last government, ended in a place where our relations with Europe felt pretty thin. The war in Europe, of course, meant that we had to come together, but I did not detect the strongest of relationships with our German, French, Irish, for example, counterparts. And so it's been essential to fix that. I was really pleased to be invited to the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union and to open up dialogue, and I hope the opportunity to return on a regular basis and be able to discuss issues of importance to us, like China, like climate, for example, and the common positions that you would expect us to reach. I think it has been important to centre defence. This is a period where, of course, NATO is first, but we also see as a result of Ukraine that on cyber, on sanctions, on other arenas of dispute and conflict in Europe, take the West Balkans, for example, take Moldova, where I was recently experiencing a serious cyber threats from Russia. There's much that we can do together. And then bilaterally, the Prime Minister and I have set about mending our relationship with Ireland with effectively a new deal. And I'll come back to you and talk about that. You'll measure me against that, as I've said. A new deal with our German colleagues. I suspect now after their general election, but we'll get there. An upgrade to Lancaster House with our French funds. There'll be a summit again next year. I went to Poland, I think, on day one in the job, and forging very strong relations with the Tusk government and Radek Sikorski particularly. And then there are tricky issues that I hope that we'll be able to get past, like the Gibraltar issue with the Spanish, for example, where I'm picking up the discussions that David Cameron was entering into and hoping that we can, solve those problems with Spain, but by being absolutely clear about the importance of Gibraltar's sovereignty. So there's a range of fronts, but in a sense, the reset is about getting into those issues, as I've just outlined, being serious about those issues, and recognising that, yes, we are outside of the European Union, but we're absolutely not outside of Europe. And of course, it's important that the deal that was struck, the bad deal that we got from the European Union, Boris Johnson's deal, that we're able to refresh that deal, and my colleague Nick Thomas-Simmons is leading on that for us. We've said that we don't want to enter the single market or the customs union, but there's much that we can do together. And now with a new commission in play, as we head into next year, those discussions can begin.
Richard, before you answer your next question, because that was quite a comprehensive answer, can I just ask sort of what would be the three, like next time you come, what are the three things that we're measuring you against when it comes to our relationship with the European Union? What can we say, oh, here are the three things that you will have done between now and when we see you next?
I think there are more than three things.
Just give us the top three.
27 countries across the Europe, and we've got war in Europe. So I think that it would be remiss if I didn't sort of centre clearly the crisis that we've got in Europe with Ukraine, particularly, and supporting Ukraine as they deal with Russian aggression. So I do think that it would probably be wrong if I didn't say that remains the number one issue and the number one subject that I discuss with fellow European foreign ministers, certainly. And we all want to see a conclusion to that war in which Ukraine prevails with their territorial integrity. But clearly over this next period, both in terms of foreign policy and my direct relationship with the European Union, in terms of the new deal that we want to strike with the European Union, but also those key bilateral relationships, I think that you will be able to talk about what's in that new friendship treaty with Germany, what's in a refreshed Lancaster House, what's the result of that re-engagement with Ireland, particularly, and I hope that we can make progress on Gibraltar.
You use the language of a friendship treaty with Germany, which evokes quite warm, fuzzy feeling, but I do wonder, in terms of substance, whether on the defence and security side we're actually going to see something that is really substantial and meaningful. We know, for example, that Europe would like the UK to contribute more, to put more in relation to defence and security into our links with Europe. Would we consider, for example, association with the European Defence Agency or the Peace Facility?
Well, all of those things are under consideration, but they've all got to be done within a fiscal environment and our obligations to NATO particularly, and within the context of the strategic defence review that the Defence Secretary conducting. So I can't make that commitment here in front of the committee, but I recognise why you raise those. For example, certainly, for example, in the Western Balkans, I think that there is more that the UK can do, and I'm thinking back to the considerable work that Tony Blair did the last time that Labour was in power, and the contribution we made to the Western Balkans, for example.
One more on
yes, one more.
EU. In terms of what the EU asks from us, they've often asked that we reinvigorate the youth mobility arrangements that we used to have, or at least have an EU-UK youth mobility scheme. You've often turned that down on the basis that we don't want to re-enter freedom of movement, and I get that, but this isn't freedom of movement. So what is it that's actually stopping us from undertaking a youth mobility scheme?
Well, we have no plans in relation to youth mobility, and we've made that clear. that did come up under the last commission, but we have a new commission which is barely days old. We will enter into discussion with them in good faith, but we have set out some red lines. Free movement is one of those red lines. But I recognise that European colleagues do raise, for example, a fall in the number of school trips that young people are making to our country in both directions, and that can't be a good thing. All of us want to see young people travelling to France and Germany and vice versa. So I do recognise that Europeans raise those issues, but what I think I'm not going to do, and I know that my colleague Nick Thomas-Symonds won't be keen to do, is to do a sort of blow by blow that you sort of read across the papers in those negotiations, and sort of war amongst ourselves or whatever. These are serious discussions that we will enter into in a spirit of good faith, and we'll have to see where we get to.
Thank you. Good. Middle East. We have lots of questions on this. Matthew, I think you're going to kick off.
Thank you, Chair. I cannot imagine the horror that Emily Damari, now well over a year in captivity in Gaza, is going through. I know that you have talked about stepping up diplomatic efforts to secure her release. Could you update us on those efforts, what that looks like, and what progress is being made to get Emily home?
Well, can I say I have met with Emily's courageous and inspirational mother, and the Prime Minister has met with her as well, and we are in pretty regular contact, you know, it's actually quite emotional thinking about the plight of Emily and those hostages that have some connection to the UK particularly, but all of those hostages, and for those families not knowing the fate of their loved ones. We continue to press for a ceasefire. I have been calling for a ceasefire now for almost 12 months and working day on day to secure it. I'm pleased that today that we are talking at least about a ceasefire in Lebanon, but that ceasefire in Gaza has still eluded the international community. And that principally, of course, has been working with Israel, with our US colleagues. I was with Tony Blinken again on Monday discussing what prospects we might have with the Qataris and others who have roots into Hamas. And we are doing all we can, both to, you know, find signs of life and to do all we can, frankly, to assist with those hostages. But as I say, that ceasefire has eluded, and I can't update the committee today about, I wish I could give you good news, but I have no news in relation to that particular file.
Thank you for your answer and for your daily efforts to secure her release. There is obviously an extremely concerning situation in Gaza in relation to aid, and that is desperately, urgently needed to increase. I read reports that suggest some elements of aid required going through about 10 sign-off processes, different bodies. That means that it takes over a month to get certain basic foods in there. How can that be streamlined to speed that process up and ensure we get the aid into Gaza?
I spoke to Commissioner Lazzarini this morning, about the situation in Gaza. At this point in time, the situation is so bleak that, to quote his words, there are no words, words fail me. As you know, the UK has sent and continues to send a lot of aid. We're particularly focused, and I particularly have been focused in office on medical aid and the support that we want to give the Gazans, many of whom are injured or ill as a consequence of the famine that is setting in. But the issue remains now the ability to get the aid distributed across the country, the lawlessness that has set in and the widespread looting of the aid that is there, the constant displacement of people from one area to another area and then not allowed back. Northern Gaza now is a sort of a zone where people have been pushed out of increasingly, and when there's still quite a strong IDF presence. The situation is just tremendously horrendous. It's appalling. The reports of starvation and famine are deeply worrying. And I need to say also to this committee that I had to make a very sober, hard assessment on whether we could continue to send, under our own robust export licensing regime, arms to Gaza. And the reason I decided that I had to suspend arms that could be in breach of international humanitarian law to Gaza were, one, because when I looked at the assessments, there was a clear risk on that legislation on the issue of aid and access and starvation. And two, there was an issue on the treatment of detainees and some of the issues that I'm sure would concern the committee in relation to that particular group. That's why I had to make the decision to suspend arms, and those were issues that went to the heart of international humanitarian law.
I ask, what assessment have you made of the concerns raised by the Israeli military of a Hamas resurgence, and does that further jeopardise the efforts to get aid into Gaza? I worry it makes what sounds like an incredibly difficult task almost borderline impossible. What's your assessment of their claims? What's your assessment of the nature of the conflict and how that impinges on getting aid in?
Well, what Commissioner Lazzarini tells me is that the Israelis are placing very strong restrictions on what can get in to Gaza. In conversation with Foreign Minister Saar and the previous Foreign Minister Katz, Israel does raise concerns about equipment that might get in on those trucks and then might be used against IDF soldiers or indeed against the Israeli population. I recognise that are those concerns, and that's why they say there are restrictions. As I said, there is now widespread looting. There are no journalists in Gaza. There are no politicians like me able to go to Gaza, so I'm unable to verify who is behind the looting. But clearly there's now widespread criminality. So the situation, I suspect, is tremendously complex. But look, what I have to keep in mind is, notwithstanding the evils of the Hamas terrorist group, and let me be absolutely clear, and the abhorrence of October the 7th and all that happened and what Hamas represent, there are amongst those, amongst that population, innocent civilians at death's door, and this is a conflict in which the largest group of people who've lost their life are children. And so this is something that causes tremendous concern, and it's definitely an issue that foreign ministers across the G7 are just deeply, deeply concerned about at this time. And frustrated, I think. Frustrated is probably the right thing to say.
With the Chair's indulgence, I'm going to ask a short question.
You could give a short answer.
Sorry, but
it's a very, very important subject. It's just we're under such tight
I'm so sorry.
constraints.
I'm happy to come back.
Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned the work of UNRWA, vital in getting aid in, much needed aid. But I also am aware of the £1 million we've invested in the reforms that we feel are necessary. I believe you committed to an annual audit of the work done to introduce those reforms. Will the outcome of that audit be made public? And can I ask by when that audit will have taken place?
Well, we reinstituted the funds to UNRWA at the beginning of September, I think it was. But forgive me if I got it. It's been busy for 4.5 months, but I think it was around the beginning of September.
I think it was July.
July. Forgive me. Sorry, July. I spoke to Madame Colonna to make that decision and read her report. $1 million of that, as you say, is for the reforms that are necessary. I did raise that with Mr. Lazzarini this morning, and of course we talked about UNRWA because of the Knesset bills and the suggestion that all funds and all support to UNRWA would be suspended entirely, which would have huge catastrophic implications, not just in Gaza but also in the occupied territories. And therefore, of course, I will update the committee and update the House on the work that we've put behind that reform. But clearly this is a changing picture, and at this point in time, it is still the intent, it would seem, to withdraw complete support from UNRWA, and therefore there may be very little for us to report on if that were to go ahead next July. But I'm doing a lot of work to ensure that that is not the case. I think it would be the wrong decision for Israel's security, and it would certainly be the wrong decision for the people who rely on the services of UNRWA in both Gaza and the occupied territories.
I have a question I'd like to ask, but I'm not. But what are you going to do to stop the Israelis implementing the UNRWA bill then? I mean, this is going to be within the Knesset because it's so important that this doesn't happen. So what is Britain doing in order to stop that?
Well, it's not just Britain acting on her own.
No.
On Monday at the G7, this was a topic of discussion across all foreign ministers. We were all unified in our concerns about UNRWA. There was a communique that flowed from that, where that was referred to. There's a lot of diplomatic activity going on at the moment to urge the Israelis not to implement those bills and to impress on the Israelis that we think that this would be catastrophic for their own security. Yes. Let's just focus on the occupied on the West Bank and East Jerusalem. UNRWA is providing healthcare. It's providing schools, not just food and aid. It would be catastrophic to withdraw those services, and if you were withdrawing those services, then I assume the Israelis are saying that they're going to provide them, which I think would be very, very problematic for them. There are legal obligations as an occupying power, and I'm afraid that the international community is very clear about those obligations as an occupying power, and we do have to hold Israel to an account. I expect, as a democratic nation, Israel has to keep in mind its obligations under international law.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, my questions will be in relation to the West Bank, the annexation that's due to take place there. So over the last 30 years, there's been a 134% increase in the number of settlements in the West Bank. The ICJ ruled in July of this year that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is illegal, We obviously heard the comments from Minister Smotrich in relation to 2025 being the year of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. My question is, with the likely intention of an annexation taking place next year, and this potentially bringing an end, any view of a Palestinian state if annexation does take place, what will our government's response be, and will it be consistent in line with the response that we have had in relation to annexation in Ukraine? And I make reference to specific sanctions that we've given, economic sanctions to Russia, and severe diplomatic sanctions as well. So given that this is quite a severe thing, that many Palestinians will be looking to see what will happen, and potentially it could be the conclusion of a recognition, what will the actions be?
Well, I want to be crystal clear. It is the UK government's position that we want to see two states. We want to see a secure and safe Israel, but the Palestinian cause and the desire for a state of their own is an admirable one that I would want to support. There can be no room for annexation, which would be illegal and quite out with of international law and international norms. So I've heard that talked about, but again, across the G7 that I've just come from, there was widespread concern about any suggestion of annexation, because annexation would run a coach and horses through the Oslo Accords and through our desire for a two-state solution to this problem.
If it goes ahead, what actions would we take in consequence?
I understand why you're pushing, of course I do, but I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals of that kind. I am going to do all I can to ensure that that does not happen.
Okay. Second question just relates to the ICC arrest warrants that took place. So in light of the arrest warrants and us standing by international law, which was absolutely the right decision, and respecting the international legal system, will you as Foreign Secretary and the officials continue to engage and meet with a man who is now wanted for war crimes?
Well, on the basis of what you've just said to me, there are two things that I'm holding at the same time. One is our obligations under the Statute of Rome and our powerful belief both in the rule of law and international humanitarian law. We have to wait in the coming days, weeks, for what they call a notes verbial to make its way to our embassy so that we enforce or we get instructions that we are to enforce these warrants were they to arise. Under our legislation, Section 2 of the International Criminal Courts legislation, there is an obligation on me to transmit to the courts should those named seek to come into our country. That doesn't allow me any discretion. I will issue that, transmit that to the courts, and then the courts will make their determination under our law, recognising that we are signatories to the Statute of Rome, and these are very, very serious issues indeed.
Before we move on, though, I'm just thinking about the answer that you gave to Abdesam. I just want to follow it up because I just think it's important. You were talking about in the G7 and about discussions, and presumably it has been raised. There's a possibility that there might be an illegal annexation. Even if you can't speculate, tell us, about sensitive conversations. Is there a plan B if Israel does try to annex?
Well, look, I want to keep hope alive. And what is the hope? The hope is that Israel is able to secure a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. And as part of that normalization deal, there is a pathway to a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. And I think we all recognise that under President-elect Trump's presidency last time round, they were able to secure the Abraham Accords, and normalisation followed with countries like Bahrain, Morocco and UAE. It would be a great achievement if Saudi Arabia were able to secure that. But all of us who've been to the region know that that is impossible without two states and without that promise for the Palestinian people. And that is obviously where a lot of us will be focusing our attention over the coming months.
Give me up, Sana.
Okay, just to follow up. So you spoke earlier about holding you account or judging you by the deals that you'll achieve. Will the recognition of a Palestinian state be amongst those deals?
Well, I've said that if we get normalisation, then by definition, I suspect, we are on a path to that two states. And we have said that that recognition is a tool. It doesn't deliver that end, but it's an important stepping stone on the road. So, for example, you could see recognition alongside a deal of that kind.
Okay. And then just coming back to my second question about the arrest warrants, I don't think you answered the question. If there were opportunities to engage or meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu, would you still engage with discussions given that he is a wanted man? And has there been a precedent for engaging with somebody where arrest warrants are in place?
Well, I'm informed, of course, by the Attorney General and lawyers. I believe that there can be engagement in emergency situations, for sure. My own view is, some people criticise the fact that I met Bibi Netanyahu, but I absolutely stand by the ability to talk to Bibi Netanyahu about access and aid, as I did in the first few weeks in office, to be able to talk about Gaza, to be able to talk about normalisation, to be able to talk about Lebanon, to be able to question on things like UNIFIL or our support for the Lebanese armed forces. I do believe that those are important matters that require engagement from those of us in government. And I think it would be hugely problematic were we not able to do that on behalf of our country, of our constituents, and everyone who wants to see a ceasefire, who wants to see the aid get in, and wants to see those hostages get out. And I've got to be able to talk to the Prime Minister if I'm serious about getting Emily Damari home. So I can't see circumstances under which I would not be speaking to the elected representatives of the Israeli government.
Thank you. Uma, I think you've got something else we want to just ask a couple of questions on.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, my questions are on sanctions. I'm going to focus the first two on the situation in Gaza. You've been clear, including in the Chamber yesterday, that you won't be drawn on sanctions that are under considerations. I've previously written to you about the use of Magnitsky sanctions. So I want to ask you about the way that decisions are made rather than forthcoming decisions. What's prompted your department's review of the sanctions policy, and will the review consider sanctions designations as well as implementation?
I think we've been pretty good on the designations. They do take a lot of work from forensically on the individuals or organisations that are under consideration. A lot of work legally to make sure that we're on the right side of the law and the sanctions that we put in place are fair and not subject to legal challenge. They engage usually more than one government department to put that work together. Sometimes they involve agencies like the NCA and others. But the designation process itself, I'm pretty comfortable with, notwithstanding that all governments do not have endless resources, and this is a lot of resource, certainly for the FCDO particularly. But in my period, you've seen a record number of sanctions, particularly on Russia and Putin and the system there, but also in relation to settler violence and some of my concerns about expansion particularly. The review specifically is about enforcing those sanctions, given the question that the chair raised with me right at the very beginning. We don't talk about designations because that would undermine the effect of the sanctions. If we did talk about them, by definition, people would move things around, disappear. It would make it harder to do the job. So that's why we don't talk about designations as the government. But of course, I recognise that both in Parliament, probably around this committee, people will have views and express those views, and you're free to do that. And we are listening.
Thank you. And I welcome the fact earlier you said that you are open to more scrutiny and a thorough look, parliamentary scrutiny of sanctions policy as well. So just turning to what the UN has said in relation to what's going on in Gaza, UN legal experts have issued a statement calling for sanctions on individuals and entities involved in the unlawful occupation in Gaza Strip. In October, an average of just 37 trucks a day of aid entered, compared to over 500 entering per day prior to October 7th last year. In November, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification reported that there is a strong likelihood that famine is currently ongoing in northern Gaza. You acknowledge this today. You've said that sanctions designations are kept under review, but what does this mean in practice for those on the ground in Gaza in the context of aid blockade and escalating humanitarian crisis?
Well, sanctions is one tool, and it's a tool that we've used particularly in this part of the world, looking at issues in the West Bank and East Jerusalem particularly. On the broader issues of aid and the tremendous suffering that we're seeing in Gaza, the effort is to get a ceasefire, and the effort is why I was talking to Commissioner Lazzarini this morning of the whole international community, is to see a surge in aid and get aid into Gaza. Now, I was talking to King Abdullah a few weeks ago. There's tremendous frustration in Jordan. Jordan is a really close partner of the United Kingdom. King Abdullah is keen to have an air bridge. We're giving him a lot of support in the planning of that air bridge to do airdrops into Gaza, and we will support him with that endeavour. So the aid question is about getting the aid in. I don't think it's entirely about sanctions policy.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. And the Chair
If you promise it's one short question, we get one short answer. I'm so far behind.
It's a question in relation to this government's stance and international obligations. Today marks an important day for Tamil people around the world. In 2023, you urged the then British government to stand shoulder to shoulder with Tamils and consider the recommendation of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to refer perpetrators of atrocities to the International Criminal Court. The then leader of the opposition also urged the then government, to consider the recommendation of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for an international justice mechanism. I'm really pleased to say you are now the Foreign Secretary and he is now the Prime Minister. Can I ask you today to stand by your comments and refer them to the ICC?
We've got a new government that's just taken up in Sri Lanka, and it's a government, and the signs are positive in relation to the atrocities of the past and the human rights abuses of the past particularly. It's important that Minister West and I are able to engage with that new government. We are looking at the range of policy in relation to the atrocities of the past particularly, and as you know, I've spent a lot of time over the years with Tamil communities, particularly in this country. So I recognise the strength of feeling and why you've raised these issues. They are complex issues. Nevertheless, That is, that goes back to conflict where deep, painful atrocities were committed, and it's important that those that did that are held to account.
Right. We have very little time. We have a lot of world left to get round, so may I move on to China?
Yes, we'll try and do China quickly. Thanks for your offer to come talk about the China audit when it's complete.
Yes.
When you've been speaking about that, you've used this mantra of cooperation, competition, and challenge. And I wanted to sort of focus on the relationship between the first two of those. So the cooperation part of that suggests the trade and the investment that we want, which is something we want. But the challenge part suggests that there's something that China wants that we can give to them. And I'm interested in order for the challenge part of that relationship to work, what are we willing not to give to them? So, for example, when the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Prime Minister go to China next year, what are they willing not to give in order to, for example, secure the release of Jimmy Lai if he is still in arbitrary detention at that point?
Well, look, I understand the thrust of your question. The starting point, I think, is to make an honest assessment of where UK policy is in relation to China. And if I were being generous, I would describe the last government's policy in relation to China at woefully inconsistent, bouncing around from the golden age under David Cameron to Liz Truss's position. China is a threat. Then you've got people like Chris Patton and Ian Duncan Smith with different positions. So we did not have a consistent policy, and worse than that, there was no engagement.
Secretary of State, the question's not that. The question is about how do we challenge? That's the question, and it's important.
Well, the reason why I sought to start the question like that was simply to say that the engagement that we've begun after a period of 6 years of no engagement from Prime Minister has only just begun. And it's very hard to broker changes in behaviour, particularly where we disagree passionately on cases like Jimmy Lai's case, if there is no relationship. So that's why I've underlined the 3 C's, which I think are very important. And, Britain will not resile from our views on the national security law in Hong Kong. We will not resile from important concerns that we have for Uyghurs or for Jimmy Lai. And we challenge because we must do. But diplomacy is about engagement. There is no diplomacy without engagement, without sustained conversations. And that's why it was important that when I went to China, that I was able to reopen dialogues between our country on different areas. And some of those areas we can cooperate on, like climate or health. There are lots of trade are not matters of huge concern. Both sides of us want to see more of it, but there are important security concerns in some areas where we will compete, and where we will be pretty exacting about what we're unable to do trade with them on.
I appreciate absolutely the point on 4.5 months in, and I should say when I've had conversations with Jimmy Lai's son, he's very grateful for what you've done personally, what the Prime Minister has done. So perhaps maybe more slightly backward looking. You look at the last few years, the Canadians have managed to get the 2 Michaels out of China. The Australians got, under the Labour government, Cheng Lai out of Australia. The US got Pastor David Lynn out, and today another 3 prisoners were released there. But after 4 years nearly of solitary confinement, we haven't been able to get our citizen out. And I wonder, is there something particular about the UK-Chinese relationship that makes it more difficult for us to get what we want in these situations? Or is there something particular about the way British diplomacy has attempted to do it? Is it the context, or is it our toolbox that's lacking?
Well, Blair, I think that the context is the lack of engagement between the UK and China. That is the difference between us and the United States. That is the difference between us and, say, Australia. Now, that is not to say, of course, and I think it would be important to say, that the Chinese-Australian relationship has had the imposition of tariffs, has had big differences of opinion. Again, I think that there was a change in approach by the Albanese government, who also talked about the 3 Cs and have entered into a different place. And the results that you suggest indicate that engagement has borne fruit, despite the tremendous strains between the United States and China. President Biden, Janet Yellen and others have had a lot of contact with their opposite numbers. That is what the Prime Minister and I are seeking to replicate, because it is only with a relationship that we can get results in the areas that really matter to us, as you're indicating in your questions.
In the interest of being helpful, I could ask my next section in one question, following on.
If
that's helpful. So a couple of years ago, Foreign Secretary, you made the commitment to make consular assistance a legal right for people, and then a year later you committed to a new special envoy for arbitrary detention. I wonder if you want to give us an update on both of those, and if there is a timeline for achieving them, because I've asked about Jimmy Lai, but I could have asked about Ali Abdel Fattah or Ryan Cornelius, or any number of cases. So there's obviously bigger issues, and I say again a sort of toolbox question about whether we have the framework we need to get success in these cases.
I do hope to announce an envoy, a special an individual who will deal with those more complex detention cases. And I have been looking hard at the 28,000 people at any one time that come through our system. And obviously it's varied from someone who's arrested for being drunk in Magaluf, to, sadly, there have been high-profile cases where British citizens have sadly lost their lives for very varied reasons abroad. Overwhelmingly, I do want to pay tribute to the consular staff and the way that we support people. But in these more complex cases, there are issues that we saw in opposition. I remain sure in office that those issues remain, and we need a tightening of grip in relation to how we deal that. So I hope to come forward with proposals, and of course the committee. And actually, let me just say, we were informed by this committee's previous reports and concerns about the way those complex cases were being dealt with, and informed by this own committee's work. We will be coming forward with plans in the coming months.
And on the legal right to consular access as well?
I've got to stick to my form of words. We will be coming forward with plans, because we haven't quite got there in the coming months.
John.
One of the reasons why Jimmy Lai is in prison is because of his work in setting up an independent newspaper. And unfortunately, the number of journalists who are killed or being imprisoned has been steadily rising. Now, the UK helped set up the Global Media Coalition in 2019. Can you say, is the Foreign Office still attaching a priority to working for media freedom, and what levers are you willing to pull to try and obtain it?
I'm so sorry, John, I missed the end of that question. Are we sorry?
Is the Foreign Office still making global media freedom a priority, and what levers are you willing to pull to try and achieve it?
Yes, I do recognise that the last government prioritised working with media on the ground, grassroots, in communities all across the world. That was important work. I suppose I'm focused in relation to that work on disinformation and misinformation particularly. And I think that is a particular issue in countries like Moldova and Europe where we are supporting and doing work. And I'm also keen, as you would expect from a progressive Foreign Secretary, to also be clear that the rules-based order particularly and the broader family of issues that sit under the sort of human rights umbrella are also on our minds as we endeavour in that work. So we're looking at this holistically, but the work that I saw under the last government in this area was good work, and I would hope that it would continue.
I think we can move on. Yeah.
Can I move on to a couple of questions about the British Overseas Territories, and specifically the Chagos Islands? It's now about 7 weeks since you told Parliament about the agreement with the Mauritian government, but we still have not seen any details of the treaty that entails or the financial arrangements which will be attached to it. Can you say when those are going to be put before Parliament?
Well, the first thing is obviously we had the broad arrangements of a deal, and we came to Parliament to be very clear and to announce that we felt that we had reached a deal. And I should say that these discussions begun under the last government. There were 10 rounds of discussion. We picked this up, put a lot of effort into it. We put that effort into it because we believed that national security was at stake, particularly working with our closest ally, the United States, on their understandable national security concerns to get that deal over the line and to strike a good deal. And I am really, really pleased with the deal that we have struck. But you are right, at the same time, there's been an election in Mauritius. And we have only just engaged with the new government in Mauritius. There was an exchange of letters between the Prime Minister and the new leader of Mauritius, and I was very pleased to see him confirming that he is open to this deal. We've got to give him time to get into the arrangements for the deal, but I hope in due course that we can sign the treaty and we can bring these issues before Parliament in the usual way.
Is Jonathan Powell on his way to Mauritius now?
No, he's not on his way to Mauritius. He's back from Mauritius. I saw him yesterday.
But the Prime Minister has expressed doubts about the agreement after meeting Jonathan Powell.
I've seen those reports. I can only pray and aid the exchange of letters that we had with the new Prime Minister of Mauritius, and I'm very, very confident that this is a deal that the Mauritians will see in a cross-party sense as a good deal for them.
The new Prime Minister of Mauritius actually described it as high treason and a sellout, so that does not sound as if he's going to be very happy with it. Are you likely to offer more money as part of the deal with Mauritius?
John, he did not say that yesterday, did he? He did he?
He didn't say it. He
John,
did say it during his election campaign.
Yes. And both you and I,
people say things
John,
in election
both you and I have said things
happen.
during the election in order to get elected. He did not say that yesterday.
And the incoming Secretary of State in the United States, or the likely incoming Secretary of State, has also expressed severe doubts about this treaty. So do you actually think that it's going to come about?
Let's be clear, John, because this is incredibly serious. I know, and I'm sad that there's been so much politicking about this. This process began under a last government, and there were ministers who understand entirely why this is so important for our national security and global national security. The agencies in the United States think this is a good deal. The State Department in the United States think this is a good deal. And most important of all, the Pentagon and the White House think this is a good deal. And that's not just the principal politicians. in those areas. It is the system, because what we inherited was a situation where the base was insecure as a result of decisions made by the International Court of Justice, and the legal basis for Diego Garcia was under tremendous threat. We had to pick that up, and we had to try and secure the future of the base for many generations to come, and that is what we did. And it is a very good deal, and most particularly for our national security, and I'm really reassured about that, and I think an incoming administration will be reassured about that, and I'm confident that the Mauritians are still sure about that, despite politicking that we all know goes on.
Well, I'm sure we may return to this shortly, but in the interest of time.
Afra, was there anything that you wanted to... Has it all been covered?
Yes, I just wanted to ask about the... there was reporting of recently of phone hacking in the British High Commission in Mauritius. Can I ask you whether you've launched an investigation into whether our post in Mauritius was affected? And are you aware of any risks that discussions that you held were potentially recorded?
If you talk to me about risks, cyber attacks and the security of our systems is one of those risk register issues that I and Philip necessarily are engaged with. And there are our adversaries who would seek to undermine us by getting inside our systems. The issue that you refer to is being properly investigated and fully understood. I have not had conversations at the high security levels in that way, in a way that could be breached, because that would not be appropriate for me as Foreign Secretary. My conversations in relation to some of the issues that we discussed are had in different forums, in the safest of environments, not across technology.
Well, we better move on quickly. We've got Ukraine to deal with. Richard.
Thanks, Emily. I'd like to ask first Foreign Secretary about the business of frozen Russian assets. Clearly your government's made a positive step by seizing and confiscating the interest on assets that we hold here in the UK. But what about the principle? What about the assets themselves? We know that Czechia, Finland, Estonia have managed to seize and confiscate those assets and offer them to Ukraine. Can we not do the same in the UK? And why not?
Well, look, I think it's an area that's important for us to lead on, particularly. There's a debate across Europe. There are differences of opinion, both in terms of legal systems and the legal veracity of that move, and there are obviously complex issues within our own legal system to work through. But my bottom line is Putin should pay for this war of aggression. And we should use all means necessary to ensure that he pays for the aggression, not us, ultimately, when this is determined. It's hugely important that we support Ukraine with all of the funds necessary. My focus is to get them the funds that they need, the money out the door quickly. That's why we made a pledge to get the equipment out the door within 100 days. The extra $3 billion that we found for military support, and to encourage others. That's both in terms of the ERA loan that is on the table, to get it into their coffers for 2025, and to ensure that they're in a strong, sustainable position into 2025. But there is a broader discussion on what more in terms of funds and in terms of assets, and I will continue to have those conversations. And of course, the Baltics are very, very strong on that, and as you know, the UK is generally aligned with the Baltic nations in relation to how we see this threat from Putin.
And one, if I may, on security guarantees. We can sense that there's not a consensus amongst NATO countries at the moment for Ukraine joining NATO at this time. If we fail to get that consensus in the future, will the UK consider offering a different sort of security guarantee so that we don't see a further aggression against Ukraine?
Well, we were able to agree at NATO that there is an irreversible path for Ukraine to NATO membership. I think that was the right position to reach, and I was pleased that we reached that consensus. And of course, we have to ensure, as European allies, that when this is over, that Putin cannot come back for more. And that means that Ukraine will need the necessary security guarantees to achieve that. And it means, too, that this has to be stronger than the deal that was pulled off by France and Germany, the Minsk agreement, which did not give Ukraine that surety. I'm not going to make a commitment that commits troops. I can't do that in this select committee. And if I did, that would be the main story coming out of the select committee. But I understand the strength of your feeling and why Ukraine will need those security guarantees.
Right. John, you had one question.
Yes, just to follow up from Richard's question. This government and indeed the last have been hugely supportive of Ukraine in terms of financial assistance, but obviously that is relatively small in comparison to that which has come from the United States. There are obviously real concerns about the continuation of that, and the answer to it may be to use the Russian money that is frozen in order to ensure that Ukraine is still able to afford to defend itself. Is that something you will now examine urgently?
We are examining those issues alongside European colleagues.
So can we look forward to legislation to actually allow the...
I said we're examining those issues. I also said the issues are complex. And frankly, you're not going to achieve the end result if countries are going unilaterally at this pace. So my number one focus was ensuring that the UK was the most forward-leaning in our support, and I think with 12.8 billion and 7.8 billion on military aid and 5 billion on economic and humanitarian support, we are in that strong position. It was alongside the Defence Secretary making sure that we didn't just make pledges, but we got it out the door in 100 days, and we are doing that as well, all to put Ukraine in the strongest position and to urge our European colleagues not to be over-focused on January the 20th, but to recognise that winter has come, it is here, and let us put Ukraine in the strongest position now. And that is what we're centred on.
Right. You've got some questions on post-conflict states.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, maybe very immediately post-conflict, but what lessons from the ceasefire achieved in Lebanon for our efforts to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza?
UK leadership. We were the first country to call for a ceasefire. We gathered together our G7 partners very quickly. We were clear on supporting the Amos Hochstein plan. It was the right plan. We had a UN resolution 1701 that we all stood behind. We've been investing in the Lebanese army now for many, many years. It wasn't frequently discussed, frankly, in the House prior to the crisis in Lebanon. I was in Lebanon last January as Shadow Foreign Secretary because I could see what was happening in the region. It was getting ahead, being on it, UK leadership, playing our part in securing that ceasefire, and I'm pleased that we did that.
In the spirit of getting ahead, obviously we're hoping to achieve the ceasefire in Gaza. We're hoping that there'll be a rebuilding then of Gaza. What lessons can we learn from our past, I'm thinking about Iraq, that we need to learn in those next steps for Gaza to bring about its redevelopment, reconstruction?
I see. You're right to focus on the day after. This crisis will end. Gaza has to be rebuilt. There is a challenge at the moment because if you speak to any Arab partner, they're not prepared to commit funding off the back of occupation. They're not prepared to commit funding with no guarantee that they won't be spending that money again in 20 years' time. Nevertheless, I think that Israel needs to feel secure in its borders, and to feel that October the 7th is not going to happen again. That takes guarantees that help Israel feel secure. That means working with partners to secure that. And clearly, reconstruction will have to begin. And that also means leadership in terms of international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and others. So there is much work to do on that roadmap for the future of Gaza. And of course, the UK is playing its role on the day after and what takes place. I was discussing that with the Quint of Arab states on Monday. But of course, at this point in time, there is still a lot of angst and upset and frustration that the ceasefire has not arrived, and therefore we're not able to implement the day after and get on with the business of reconstructing Gaza. And there is concern, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, that there are some in the Israeli system that do not intend to leave.
Yes. One last question.
Thank you. You mentioned some of the guarantees that we need to offer Israel as an ally for it to feel secure in a region that's seen the devastating attack of October 7th. Could you comment on the nature of those and what we as a UK government can do to offer those reassurances?
Well, I think thank you for the question, because it is important to put this on record. People forget that Israel had put up for several years with rocket fire from Hamas into Tel Aviv and broader Israel. Israel had put up with rocket fire from Hezbollah. It had a devastating atrocity committed on it on October the 7th, and that's caused national trauma, understandably. If our country had experienced something like that, the trauma would have been deep and long-standing. And obviously, notwithstanding the ceasefire that has been achieved in Lebanon, the real test is, can people go back to their homes in northern Israel? And we will see over the coming weeks whether people feel secure enough to do. That is the test in the end, so people can live safe within their borders. And of course, the UK will play its role in achieving that, which is why, and we should not forget, it's not come up really at the committee today, that we mustn't forget the pernicious role of Iran in this, sitting behind proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis and others, and an ideology that wants to see Israel driven into the sea, and an ideology that's busy at the moment on nuclear enrichment, which we must stand up to and stand against, because it would make the Middle East more dangerous than it currently is if we saw nuclear escalation as well. So this is complex, but that gets to the heart of the guarantees that the Israeli people rightly and appropriately need to see if we are to get to peace in the region.
Would you indulge us, Secretary of State? I'm very grateful to you for staying at longer than you said.
I don't even know what time it is. Is it?
It's fine. It's fine. It's actually only 4:15, so let's carry on.
We can ask lots of questions, and the committee has certainly
we can ask lots of questions on Iran if you allow us. But what I'm going to try and do is keep to a very short number of questions on the United States, because we have to have some questions on the United States, and we will have. Obviously we're a new committee, we're very keen, and I have to say I compliment fellow members of the committee for being as disciplined as they have been and for getting us through. But I would like us to ask a few questions about the States, and Afra, I think, is going to lead off.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. I'm sure you'll agree that the US is our closest ally, and that the special relationship is an alliance and a friendship like no other. You have in the past made some extremely undiplomatic remarks about incoming US President Trump. And as you've noted today, language matters. Given some of your past remarks, including, I think, comparing President-elect Trump to Hitler in a tweet, calling him a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath, calling him a profound threat to the international order that has been the foundation of Western progress for so long, and saying that Donald Trump is not welcome in our country. Do you now regret your comments, and what actions will you be taking to strengthen the special relationship with the incoming Trump administration?
Well, look, can I say that you're absolutely right that the United States is our closest ally. We have a very important, deep military partnership over many years. I think there are 10,000 US troops based in this country, over 30,000 across Europe. We have a tremendous intelligence capability working with the United States and our Five Eyes partners. That was on show in the run-up to the war in Ukraine. We have over 1.1 trillion invested in each other's economies, 2 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. And the truth is, whoever is in the White House or number 10, whatever political party, our relationship is key and is important, not just to our own populations, but to global security. And that will continue. And I've got to tell you, I enjoyed meeting Donald Trump. I enjoyed, he was a very gracious host in Trump Tower. The Prime Minister and I had a good meal. We had good discussion. We had a laugh in places. And I look forward to working with him. I also have met J.D. Vance before becoming the VP candidate. We talked extensively about our two books and our understanding of impoverished communities from different political perspectives. I am a politician, Ms. Brandreth, that's worked across the political aisle for many years. That's why David Cameron asked me to lead a review into the criminal justice system. It's why I've been able to have good conversation with William Hague, who I think was broadly a very successful foreign secretary under a last Conservative government. It's why I worked with Theresa May on human trafficking and a whole range of issues. So I look forward to working with Donald Trump, and you will find, if you scan the tweets of the sort of 2014, 15, that sort of period of time, that all politicians from all descriptions had all sorts of things to say about Donald Trump. I think the last Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, described him as a misogynist and a xenophobe. He was able to go and see him in Mar-a-Lago, just as myself and Keir Starmer were able to engage with him in Trump Tower just a few weeks ago.
So do you now regret your comments?
I'm not looking back, I'm looking forward. I'm sitting here as Foreign Secretary, as the country's chief diplomat, and I have sought to use, for the last 2 3/4 hours, diplomatic language, because that's what I'm charged with doing, and I will do everything possible on behalf of the British people in relation to our national interests, and that is working with our close ally. And just as he has been gracious to me, I will be gracious to him. That is the way I was brought up in the great part of London called Tottenham and the great city of Peterborough. You're gracious to those who are gracious to you. That is what I have found in dealing with Donald Trump, and that is what he can expect from me as Foreign Secretary.
Okay, Edward.
How confident are you under a Trump presidency that the USA would fulfil its Article 5 obligations if it was called upon?
I'm so sorry.
That's right. Under a Trump presidency...
I've just been told, reminded that I've got an important meeting. So that's why I didn't...
Two questions.
It's a very short one then. Yes. Under a Trump presidency, how confident would you be that the USA would fulfil its Article 5 obligations?
Look, I'm really confident. I think it's important to recognise that Donald Trump's pushing and cajoling of Europe to step up on defence spending is consistent with Eisenhower, Kennedy, Obama all saying the same thing. Because when he came into office, there were 4 countries spending above 2% of their GDP. We fell backwards from the 2.5% we were spending in government. He was right about that. And in fact, he increased his spending on NATO, and he increased the amount of troops sent to Europe, and he sent the first javelins to Ukraine. So look, the rhetoric is tough and exacting under Donald Trump, and the global community can look back and can see that. He wants a deal. I've met him. He's certainly not a loser. I'm quite sure that NATO, as we understand it, the best alliance of countries the modern world has seen, will continue and go from strength to strength.
Yeah.
Thank you. And last question, we promised, Foreign Secretary, and we'll let you go. But this feels important. And, I completely agree, of course. Our relationship is incredibly special and important with the US. I've personally lived and worked in the US myself. But part of what makes our relationship so special is that it's been founded around, in part, shared values. Now, I do wonder, with this incoming administration, we've seen, unfortunately, even over recent years, a bit of a reduction in some ways around women's rights, particularly reproductive rights. And to some extent, to my question earlier about red lines and trade deals and discussions and relationships when it came to climate, I wonder if I could pose the same question to you here as well, to some extent, around if we see a continued infringement on women's rights, does that change the nature of our deals that you touched on earlier, and how we'll go about our relationship with the US?
We're a progressive government. We have our values, and the United Kingdom will continue to support, for example, women's reproductive rights in much of the global south. That's very important work. And that work has been consistent across Conservative governments and Labour governments. But look, I do think in thinking about our friends in the United States, it is really important that we recognise that women voted for Donald Trump in their millions, that African Americans voted for Donald Trump, that Latino and Hispanic communities vote for Donald Trump, and it's incumbent on us as politicians to reflect on that democratic process that has now come to pass. And that is why I look forward to working with the United States. As Foreign Secretary, it is important for me to say this, to put this conflict of interest on the record. I'm probably the biggest Atlanticist that there has been as our chief diplomat. I have been to the United States more times than I've been to France. I have studied, I have worked, I have family. My father is buried in the United States. It's a country I've known over many years, and I've followed it through successive presidents of different political persuasions and strides. It's a great, great country, and I remain excited and enthused and honoured to do this job, and I look forward to working with the United States ultimately to keep people safe, because that is what that partnership has achieved since the middle of the last century. It has created a global order that by and large, we don't always get it right, but by and large, it has kept many, many, many millions of people safe, and it's a great honour to do this role and to have spent such a long time with you this afternoon. Thank you.
On that note, thank you both very much for your time this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you early next year, I hope, Secretary of State. We can talk about the China review, Iran, Sudan, South America. We can talk. But this time, I think, Sir Philip, is your last time before the committee. And I just wanted to, before your retirement, I wanted to wish you all the best. And thank you very much for coming today. And
let me just put on record my thanks to Sir Philip. The transition into government has been really smooth. Philip's commitment to ensure that we had an orderly transition, that we got up to speed as a group of ministers as best we could, that we were able to implement our priorities, has been exemplary. And let me also put on my records my thank to Philip Barton. I'm very, very grateful indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Order.